There are 24 hours in a day, except for one Springfield, Illinois day in 1989, where it lasted 24 hours and 3 minutes. That's because the Illinois General Assembly had to get a vote in late at night on June 30th before the end of the fiscal year to approve a new publicly financed Comiskey Park, holding off White Sox Chairman Jerry Reinsdorf on his threats to move to Tampa. Legislative leaders turned off the clock so nobody would know what time it was, so the vote was recorded at 11:59 p.m., just in time, even though it was actually 12:03 a.m. the next day. Now, Reinsdorf had lots of friends in high places back then, including Republican Governor and Sox fan Jim Thompson and Democrat and Sox fan House Speaker Mike Madigan. And Chairman Reinsdorf has always had one major talent. No, it's not running a winning baseball franchise. It's getting taxpayers to fund his stadiums while he reaps all the profits. And earlier this year, the irascible chairman made his way to the state capitol again, hoping to do the same thing, this time seeking $1 billion to help build a gleaming new stadium on a prized piece of South Loop property known as the 78. The response from lawmakers sounds great. Good luck paying for it. 78 property owner Related Midwest really wants this stadium to happen, so much so that they hired famed White Sox groundskeeper Roger Bossard to build a beautiful professional baseball diamond on their property. This week they wined and dined lawmakers and gave them a chance to live out their childhood dreams, running the bases and rubbing elbows with White Sox legends. Current Illinois House Speaker Chris Welch says he loved it, but it didn't change his mind.
It was a beautiful baseball field with a great view. But again, that doesn't change the conversation about who pays for it.
And I can attest, my heart skipped a few beats standing behind home plate, looking out at the world's most iconic skyline, imagining munching on peanuts and Cracker Jacks, taking in a game in what could be the most breathtaking sight in all the major leagues. Here, I even tweeted about it, and the replies were telling. At Chicago Chris 50 tweeted, "And if the billionaire owner wants to build there, awesome, but no taxpayer should be paying for it when they still have debt on old stadium and stadiums are losing propositions for cities." At Panic Street said, "I agree, Jerry should pay to make it happen." At GN Foot says, "Not as cool if I, a state taxpayer, basically finance and pay $1.5 billion for the stadium to watch said baseball game, and the team I'm watching is owned by a billionaire." And Derry Garcia simply said, "Cool, have Jerry pay for it." And on and on and on it went. You get the picture. It seems like Reinsdorf's magic at getting the public to pay for his goodies has run dry. And now he's using the same playbook as before, threatening to move the team out of town, this time to Nashville. And with the Sox about to set an all-time record for losing, more and more fans are like, "Yeehaw, enjoy the Music City." The thing is, there is no appetite for public funding of pro sports stadiums. Cubs owner Tom Ricketts had to learn that the hard way. But the Ricketts got other goodies from the city instead, like an expanded amusement tax take-home and the right to shut down public streets, Waveland and Sheffield. Those are the kinds of trade-offs public officials are willing to deal on. So, lesson to the Bears and Sox. You better identify your Waveland and Sheffield, because the clock is ticking on a deal, and after months of negotiations, there are nothing but goose eggs on the scoreboard. And that's our opening shot.
Coming up on Paris on Politics.
Tonight, the debate over ShotSpotter. City Council takes on a defiant mayor. The country faces new worries of political violence after a second alleged assassination attempt against President Trump. And Chicago's Daily Show, inside the 22-year reign of Chicago's longest-serving mayor. Paris on Politics is next.
This is Paris on Politics from Fox 32 Chicago.
Welcome to Paris on Politics, where we take you behind the headlines and beyond the spin. 33-14. That's the margin Mayor Brandon Johnson lost by yesterday as alderpeople went against his wishes and voted to potentially continue the gunshot detection technology known as ShotSpotter. Afterward, a defiant mayor said he isn't backing down.
Clearly, the legal dynamic of this ordinance has left me no choice but to veto it. But I am committed to making sure that we are coming up with a collaborative approach to find systems that will actually work.
And joining us now to debate ShotSpotter and the future of the technology here in Chicago are 15th Ward Alderman Raymond Lopez, who voted for it, and 6th Ward Alderman William Hall, who voted against this ordinance. So I'll start with you, Alderman Hall. 33 to 14 vote here to basically strip the power from Mayor Johnson to end this contract and give it to CPD Superintendent Larry Snelling instead. Why did you vote against this?
Well, I voted against it, number one. That's not what democracy is. Essentially, at the end of the day, we have a system in place. Number two, to split or to try to divide a mayor versus a superintendent, one in which he chose, one who's doing a great job. I don't think that that's the way in which we should move forward as a city. I think we need as much unity as possible. I think that the mayor and the superintendent need to be in a room together, share their ideas, look at technology, share morals and values, and then present it to the city of Chicago.
But you're okay with this technology because it ends on Sunday, basically. Yes. It's done, and that's what you want, correct?
Yes, because it failed. I had a 12-year-old child in the 6th Ward. The alert went off, laid in the street for an hour. Mother found him dead. That's all of the data I needed. We had to scramble to bury this child. And so that's the data that, again, changed my mind. And again, I was open, I listened, but it was not effective. What city do we want? Detection, or do we want criminals behind bars, guns off the street, and making sure that we get convictions of those who are committing crime?
All right, Alderman Lopez, you voted for this ordinance to go against the mayor and keep ShotSpotter running. How come?
I believe in saving lives. I've seen the value of this technology, having been one of the first wards to have it in the 7th District, 7th Police District, which is shared by the 6th Ward. And I feel bad that my colleague had to go through this tragic event with this young child, but the technology worked in this instance. It was the human component that had failed, and to correlate the two as the fault of technology really shows that we're not understanding what the job of the technology is. The technology alerts you when a shooting happens. If there were personnel issues, if there were dispatching issues, those should have been rectified by the police or OEMC. So I don't find them as a grounds for a valid excuse to say no to this technology. Having seen that, the fact of the matter is that there have been 1,976 people whose lives have been impacted and saved because the technology alerted first responders when no one called 911. That's what we need. And even if the mayor chooses to go a different route, which he absolutely has the right to do, then there should be a cooling down period and a dismantling period that doesn't leave all our communities in a lurch.
ShotSpotter is not the strategy for the future. We need future technology. AI is being used in other cities. And again, ShotSpotter has been removed from 4. Houston is on the way out. San Antonio is done. Seattle is done. And again, Portland is done. If 4 are saying we're done, a 48% clearance sale is desperation. And again, no jobs,
I just want to say this.
No company connection to community. And again, show the children how this works. None of that is present with this.
Let's just say this. First and foremost, Chicago does not want to be like Seattle or Portland. We see what a mess that those two cities are and where they've gone with their pro-criminal mentality. Second, yes, you have been able to geofence in your districts. Yes, you have been able to do things with your commanders because you had the data that ShotSpotter and the SDSU.
No, we had the data that we have.
I am more familiar with what goes on in your community because we share the same district, and you have SDSC rooms that get data from the community that identify where you have blocks where you have 90 shootings in a year, 50 shootings in a year. You have over a dozen blocks that fit that category, which your commanders, community, and you have been able to isolate. But all of that is because of the data, the technology, and everything that has led up to this point. And to say that that is somehow flawed now is an incorrect assumption.
Well, again, the data that I have is Mr. Johnson, who's tired of people standing on his corner. The data I have is Cece Edwards, who's tired of people up and down the street in the wee hours of the night on the weekend. The data that I have is 5 years ago, there was a massacre on 75th Street in which over 20 people were shot. Again, ShotSpotter did not deter, ShotSpotter did not lead to conviction, and ShotSpotter left neighbors staying in the house. We need neighbors outside on the porch and police convictions as well as guns off the street.
This is a debate that's going to go on.
It's going to go on.
And we appreciate you coming here, Alderman William Hall and Alderman Raymond Lopez. Thanks very much.
Up next on Paris on Politics.
A second alleged Trump assassination attempt. Why a prominent local researcher says it's an ominous sign for the election.
Discover Chicago's hidden gems and untold tales.
If you look up, odds are you're seeing our work.
Fox 32's photographers share the stories they've captured with you.
Fountain jet shoots up 150 feet. Our designers disguise their canvas.
Streaming now at Fox 32 on Fox Local. Download Fox Local on these streaming platforms and start watching.
Another attempted assassination on former President Trump has renewed fears about political violence in advance of November's elections. This comes as Springfield, Ohio faces bomb threats and other scares in the wake of conspiracy theories about eating pets. And joining us now is national security and terrorism expert Robert Pape from the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Professor Pape, always good to talk to you. You did some research recently showing that an increasing amount of folks on the left and right say they would justify the use of force or violence to prevent the other side from taking office. So I'm wondering your reaction to what we saw in West Palm Beach this week.
I'm less surprised than many people because we've been conducting national surveys of support for political violence in the United States every 3 months, going back years, starting in June 2021. And our most recent survey found, as you said, that there is a significant radical support both on the right and the left in the United States. 10% of the public, that's the equivalent of 26 million adults, support the use of force to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president. And 7% of American adults support the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency. And this underlying radical support on both the right and the left for and against Trump helps to explain why, for years now, not just in recent days, we have been experiencing assassination attempts. So your listeners will remember that in the fall of 2022, there was an assassination attempt against Nancy Pelosi that almost killed her husband. Then last summer, there was an assailant who was surveilling former President Obama's home in Washington, D.C., and he had guns and explosives in his car, obviously seeking to assassinate former President Barack Obama.
The context
now,
here,
we're seeing 2 assassination attempts against Donald Trump. So we are seeing both on the right and the left significant, concerning support for political violence. It hasn't just grown up overnight, been building for years, and now we are seeing some actual acts of violence on both the right and the left.
And how does what's gone on in Springfield, Ohio, where schools have been evacuated, hospitals, civic buildings in the wake of Trump and running mate J.D. Vance furthering these conspiracy theories about Haitian migrants eating pets, how does that play into what your research has found?
Well, we still don't know all the details there, Paris, but almost surely this is reflecting that 7% of the public that's supporting the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency, that is, force violence for Trump. And so what you are witnessing is we are seeing quite an extraordinary period of political violence in the United States. And it's getting serious and has been getting serious for years. This isn't just gotten serious in the last few days, and it's continuing and it's building. And unfortunately, we're now just 7 weeks away from a very intense national election where these numbers I've just laid out could grow. And as those numbers grow, so could assassination attempts on both the right and the left. So we are moving into really the heart of a very extraordinary period of political violence in our country.
Coming up on Paris on Politics.
Chicago's Daily Show, a new book from a Daily Insider, explores the triumphant and tumultuous tenure of Chicago's longest-serving mayor.
Being the weather authority isn't something that I take lightly.
When you're the authority, people count on you.
And in Chicago, of course, the weather can change like that.
It's about getting on the air fast when there's severe weather.
Among the tools at our disposal now is the ability to really look into a storm.
We now have the technology to be able to get down to that street level.
To be as precise as possible.
Accurate, clear, and immediate delivery of severe weather forecasts. That's what it means to be the weather authority.
Chicago was described as Beirut on the lake and city on the brink in 1989 when a young state's attorney by the name of Richard M. Daley got elected to office. Daley, of course, a familiar name around these parts, the son of Richard J. Daley, up until that point, the longest-serving mayor in Chicago history. And a new book called The Daley Show takes readers inside what it says is the transformative reign of Chicago's Richard M. Daley. And joining us is the book's author, Forrest Claypool, who, of course, has served as head of the CTA, CPS, Park District, and chiefs of staff for both Mayor Daley and Mayor Rahm Emanuel. Forrest Claypool, welcome to Paris on Politics.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
So when Mayor Daley is elected in '89, we talked about what Chicago was facing. He gets credit in those first few years for reviving downtown, reviving the Loop, beautifying the city. What did he do and how did he pay for it?
Well, he paid for it in part by creating a very business-friendly environment and also creating a quality of life in the city. I mean, people look around today in Chicago, they see graffiti, they see homelessness, they see... And today, that was the first thing he attacked. He knew that quality of life was what mattered, a clean city, where people felt safe. Violent crime was endemic then, just as it is now, but under Daley, he drove down violent crime to 40-year lows. Again, understanding that if people don't feel safe, they won't move to the city, they won't live in the city. And of course, that then led to more complex undertakings like the public school turnaround, which helped bring middle-class families back as well. So it was a brick by brick by brick over, almost a quarter century.
And it's kind of like a similar situation where there was no money really to pay for any of this, and so he kind of expanded this controversial tax increment financing program.
Yeah.
Did it work?
It actually did, and of course, like many things in Chicago, it was abused in some times, but fundamentally, it was the only tool he had in the toolbox when he took over in 1989, and he used it aggressively, and he used it to essentially, tear down blighted buildings and replace them with anything from public investments like police stations, but also to underwrite developers who were wary about investing in the city, and by helping to sort of putting in some public money to tip the balance, he got hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of investments. Businesses began to move into the city, families and middle-class families. It was a rolling ball of momentum that took off from there. But it was creative, very creative financing at the beginning.
Another big part of that momentum, Navy Pier, which had just been sitting there for a while, and then expanding McCormick Place. Why were those such important projects?
Jobs, revenue. They brought people into the city, and they spend a lot of money when they do that. Suburbanites, out-of-towners, huge, important investments. And the theater district, which was where he really leveraged about $100 million of public money, TIF money, to leverage $300 million in private money, and they created the whole downtown Broadway in Chicago and renovated all these historic playhouses that were like 100 years old and iconic. And Chicago became really an entertainment mecca as well, and that of course led to more cultural investments and ultimately Millennium Park and all these things built on a way to bring people and money and jobs into the city. And he created in his mayoralty from '93 to 2010 more jobs in Chicago than Boston and Los Angeles combined.
And at the time, Chicago was kind of written off as lost, especially, again, in the late 80s. He was also obsessed with medians in the streets, beautification, flowers, tree plantings, light fixtures. What drove his obsession with that?
His sense of orderliness and cleanliness is fundamental to the city. And again, there was a theory called broken windows theory back in the day by some sociologists who said that when people see disorder and decay, it leads them to feel unsafe and withdraw, and that feeds on itself, and a city becomes more violent, it becomes more uninhabitable. He knew that you have to establish first out of the gate. The very first thing he did was what we called housekeeping, things like that. Get rid of graffiti, move homeless to shelters,
tear down abandoned buildings.
Tear down abandoned buildings. That's fundamental. That was the very first things that he did, and it made people feel like there was a future for the city, and they felt safe, and it allowed him to do the more difficult things then that followed after that.
Which Millennium Park was, and the legend was that he was at his dentist office looking out over the train tracks there and said, this isn't going to do. Is that how it went?
No, that's a myth, and I talk about that in the book. It's actually kind of a long and interesting story about what really happened, and that's, to me, one of the things that's interesting about the book is that we came so close so many times to things not happening. And Millennium Park was one example where it was only because an attorney named Randy Merberg at the Park District got into a fight with a parking lot operator who was facilitating abuse of the parkland. and he was operating under a lease from the railroad that owned that land at the time, that big 24-acre pit that people may remember that was so ugly. And he got so mad that he went and looked up the old deed to the land, and he discovered this remarkable thing that even though the Illinois Central Railroad had owned the land for 150 years, it was subject to a covenant that if the railroad had ever ceased railroad operations, the land would revert to the city of Chicago. And so nobody knew that.
So the city actually owned this land and it didn't even know it.
Didn't know it. And for generations.
It didn't need to spend a cent to buy it. It
no,
just already owned it.
Right. And for generations, mayors, former mayors, civic activists had tried to get the land, had tried to make it a beautiful part of the Grant Park that surrounded it, and failed because everybody thought the railroad owned it. And this one guy, Randy Merberg, because of his tenacity, changed history.
And we know what happened there, and Millennium Park certainly was a catalyst. You worked, as we mentioned, in many different capacities for the mayor. Are there any stories that you have that would sort of give viewers a sense of what his temperament was like, what it was like to work under? Was he demanding? Was he exacting?
He was demanding, but he was also fair, and he would let you run with the football as long as you were making progress. He wasn't a micromanager, and I think especially early on, I think he recruited good people and gave them leeway, and that meant a lot. So that was important. Yes, he was exacting. Yes, he could be difficult, no question about it, but he really cared so deeply about the city and the little things. I mean, for example, when he was able to overcome, I guess one of the stories of the book, Andrew Cuomo, the former mayor of New York, was the head of HUD at the time and tried to block Daley from tearing down the high-rises, came very close to succeeding, and Daley overcame that. But when he did, and he started rebuilding communities, he brought the developers in, and he was actually going down to the finest detail. He wanted wrought iron fences. He wanted certain parks and flowers around those places because he wanted them to look nice, and he was willing to put more resources into it. So he was meticulously detailed in his desire to see what his vision of the city was, and he was sort of his own chief of planning.
Speaking of being chief of planning and meticulous, everybody remembers, and this is part of his legend, Meigs Field, the old airstrip. In the middle of the night, he had long wanted to turn it into a park, and he just took matters into his own hands. So remind folks what happened and how he got away with that.
Yeah, well, that's discussed in the book a lot, and it's a fascinating story because it goes back years, and it's a big battle over years, and there's all kinds of wonderful sub-stories to it as well. But the bottom line is that he finally, after 10 years of fighting this, he said, "I've had enough." Sent the bulldozers in the middle.
There they are.
Okay. Sent the bulldozers in the middle of the night to gouge exits in the runways. There were 16 planes in the air. There were another 24 on the ground. It violated a host of FAA regulations. He was accused of being a banana republic dictator. But the airport remained closed, and he thought at that time he was going to be able to develop it into a park. But ironically, he spent all that political capital, and it never came to be. That park never was developed. The Chicago Magazine calls it a ratty park stuck in development purgatory. And he built the museum campus, he built Millennium Park, but he never got to fulfill his dream for Northerly Island Park.
And that was part of the Burnham plan originally.
Yes.
There's this arc in your book that he's flying high his first few terms, he's having big successes, he's getting elected in landslides, and then perhaps he gets maybe enamored a little too much with his own power. I mean, he had so much control. 2003, the hired truck scandal, major FBI investigation that resulted in all kinds of convictions, although he, again, skated away clean. So just give us the finer points of what hired truck was and how he was able to get away without being convicted.
Well, I think there's a larger point here, too, that, you've heard Lord Acton's maxim that all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think in Daley's case, it's not surprising that these scandals occurred when he was at the peak of his popularity and power, when he was most riding high and least willing to tolerate criticism or second guessing. And so it created a culture that allowed this corruption to flourish, where corrupt city employees and outfit families and mobsters were able to basically take over a program to lease trucks throughout the city and make millions of dollars by rigging it without competitive bidding. And 26 people went to prison. Hiring fraud was similar, where his people were illegally violating rules on patronage hiring and larding the payroll, and again, that was illegal. Did
they just use plausible deniability? I didn't know this was going on.
Well, I talk about a little bit this in the book, how good politicians kind of want to create some deniability and keep the more sordid details of politics being handled in the background a little bit. So even though he was a micromanager on government, in politics, it's sort of like, I got guys to deal with that. In the early days, he had very sophisticated people like Frank Kruse and Ed Bedore and Tim Degnan handling that in the background in a sophisticated legal way. By the time he got to those years, he had these junior troops that he was just giving orders to. They were less sophisticated. they were just like thought they were in charge, and they led him right into deep corruption.
Although we know that he left on his own terms in 2011 when he decided to hang it up after serving 1 year longer than his father, setting the record at 22 years. Is there something about his tenure and about what you write about that can be gleaned for the current administration? Are there lessons in here on how to run a city?
I think so, and there's lessons throughout, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, but I also kind of bring it all together in the epilogue at the end to compare what's happened since and what's happened in Chicago today, and actually in other cities around the country. And it's unfortunate that a lot of the progress that was made over 25 years has been eroded, and I think some of those lessons have been lost, and I think we need to remember them. You know, my high school history teacher said that the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history, but we have to, particularly I think what makes successful cities, because throughout history, cities have driven human progress. That's technological advances, financial advances, artistic advances, and it's important. We should all care about what makes cities healthy. And Mayor Daley's mayoralty, for good and bad, both good lessons and bad lessons, I think provides a lot to think about. All right, it's many fascinating insights and stories for folks like me who grew up reading about this in the news and then covering some of it. A lot of inside details here for us. Claypool, the book is The Daily Show. Congratulations. Thanks for being here. No, thanks for having me. You bet. And that's our show for this week. Enjoy your weekend and stay up to date on all the news you need with Fox Chicago on air and online. So long, everyone.